Welcome to Negotiation Made Simple, where we help you master the art of negotiation and win the next deal. I'm your host, John Lowry. On today's episode, we are going to continue our conversation about preparation. And in this particular episode, we are going to talk about preparing for what I call the dance. And so much of this preparation will happen before the negotiation starts. We're going to think about things like the alternatives to a deal, the assumptions that we often make going into a negotiation that actually can lead us astray. We will also think about the substance of the negotiation and make sure that we have that mastered so that before we ever sit down or before we ever launch the process, we've thought through these things that are critical to help us develop our bottom line and, more importantly, our ideal outcome, the place where we want to deliver the deal. I'll also answer a question from the audience about anticipating what the other side will do in negotiation, which can be difficult and is not always a perfect process, but is something that is still very valuable to do on the front end. Let's continue this conversation about negotiation preparation, one of the most important things you can do to improve outcomes in negotiation. And let's continue by thinking about how it is that we prepare for the process. So the first thing that we have to do, and the question we've got to answer here, is we've got to anticipate and ask ourselves whether the other side is likely to negotiate competitively or cooperatively. Now you ask, how do we know that? Well, in some cases, we don't. We'll have to find out in the first couple of moves. In other cases, the way that you can figure that out is to ask yourself, how important is the issue and how important is the relationship? If the issue is really, really important and the relationship is not that important to the other side, well, you can bet they're probably going to negotiate pretty competitively. If the relationship is important to the other side, that is the relationship with you, then they're more likely to negotiate cooperatively. So, for example, if you're negotiating with a loved one or a family member about something, well, it's more likely it will be competitive. If you're negotiating with an absolute stranger over a Craigslist deal about buying something, the reality is you're never going to see that person again. You're probably never going to do business with them again, and it will tend to be more competitive. And so we've got to find out the nature of the game that we're playing. And sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes you think it'll be competitive and it actually is cooperative, and vice versa. It's important to monitor those first couple of moves to try to figure out what it is that they're doing. Then the next question is, based upon what you anticipate them doing, you have to decide how competitive or how cooperative you intend to be in the negotiation. And so it's important to match their move. If they're going to be highly competitive, you will need to be highly competitive as well, or you'll lose. If they are cooperative, you don't want to be highly competitive because you run the risk that you'll turn them into being very competitive. If they're going to be cooperative, then you should be cooperative as well. And there's a good chance you're going to be able to put that deal together. And so the next question is really thinking about your strategy and matching it to what you think the strategy of the other side will be. Notice with me, though, that as we think about competitive and cooperative, that it's not static. We don't pick one and do it for the entire negotiation. This is move by move. And so throughout the course of a negotiation, you may start very competitive and then turn cooperative and then maybe get competitive again at the end. About 80% of negotiations will have both cooperative and competitive elements. And so understand the key here is to be dynamic and strategic and to do what you need to do in order to get the most value. Sometimes that's going to be competition. Sometimes it's going to be cooperation. All right, next, now we get into the substance. And so here we ask the question, how well do you understand the substance of the negotiation? Is there anything you must learn about the subject matter being negotiated before starting the process? Here's where a lot of people can make mistakes, to where if we don't know what we're talking about, or we don't know the substance of the deal, if people pick up on that, they can take advantage of us or exploit us. And so if you're buying a house, for example, it's really, really important to know kind of the mechanics of how to buy a house. You want to know what to look for on a disclosure statement. You want to do the inspections and learn all that you can in terms of what's going on with the structure of that particular house. You want to understand how escrow works. You also want to understand all of the different terms that go into a real estate transaction, because all of those things will become part of the deal. And if you don't understand those things, then you can make a mistake in terms of how it is that you can capture value in the context of that particular negotiation. It's also really important to understand the market and understand the value of the house. This is the value of getting comparables or comps. And so it's really hard to set a target in terms of the price you want to pay for the house if you have no idea what other houses in the neighborhood are selling for, or if you don't have an understanding in terms of what's gone on in terms of the real estate values in that particular area. And so you've got to understand the substance of what is being negotiated. And so if you're in sales, this really applies to your product. It's really important to understand your product. And most people don't have a challenge with this because your company will require you to know your product. Although I'm still amazed at how many times I will go into a particular place to buy something, and there will be some salesperson who knows absolutely nothing about the product that they're selling. They've got to turn to the catalog and look it up. They don't know anything in terms of customer reactions to the product or what the biggest challenges are, the biggest problems that customers have. They don't know the specifications of the product. And so it's just amazing to me still how many people don't know their product. And so it's really, really important that you are a master of the substance. And you want to learn that substance way before you start negotiating, because that substance is going to establish your target, and it's also going to establish your walkaway point. But if you don't know that substance really well, you can make a very serious mistake in terms of not setting an appropriate target or not setting an appropriate walkaway point and getting taken. So knowing the substance is critical. With that, though, one of the things that people do when they're exploring the substance, and it leads to the next question, is they make assumptions. So the next question is, what assumptions are you making going into the negotiations? Do these assumptions need to be tested before the negotiation? And so it's really important as you think about the body of information on which you are making decisions, that you carefully identify within that body of information, what are the assumptions that you are making? I've made this mistake countless times to where I made an assumption that turned out not to be true. And as a result of that, I didn't get as good a deal. Oftentimes where we get burned on this is we make assumptions about things that we think people will do, and they end up not doing them. And so perhaps we're building an assumption based upon things that they've told us. Well, they said this, so I can assume this. And the fact that they said this over here doesn't mean what you think over here is ever going to happen. And so sometimes we take people and what they say, we take it way too far, thinking they'll continue to go down that road, but they don't. And as a result of that, we've calculated that into the deal, and yet that value is never going to come our way. And so it's really important here. We have to check our assumptions And sometimes that means there's more conversation that has to happen with the other side before we start the negotiation. Sometimes that means we have to go check some things. So if we go back to the real estate deal, you may have a realtor that's telling you, oh man, the market's going crazy right now. You need to jump on this house quick. Otherwise, you're not going to get it. Well, upon hearing that, you probably want to check that to make sure that that's in fact the case. Because many times I've been told things by people that, guess what? They're not true. They're just trying to sell me. They're trying to deceive me. They're trying to make me take action when I don't need to take action. And as a result of that, when you test those things, what you find out is those things aren't true at all, and you can make better strategic decisions. So the next thing to think about is assumptions. Then from assumptions, we start thinking about alternatives. And so the next question in our preparation process is, what alternatives are available to you and the other party if the negotiation is not successful? All right, let me talk about this one for a minute, because oftentimes folks get confused. Alternatives, these are the things that could happen if you do not get a deal. So you would ask, well, John, we're trying to put a deal together. Why would I spend a lot of time thinking about what happens if I don't put the deal together? Well, the reason is because those alternatives, as good or as bad as they are, those will impact the amount of leverage that you have in the negotiation. The same for the other side. And so as we're thinking about alternatives, what we're trying to do here is to build leverage or identify the leverage that we have. So alternatives, as we answer this question, I want you to think very broadly about all the things that could happen. And so if we're thinking about the real estate deal, the reality is that the market could crash and the value of the house could go down. Maybe it's not likely to happen, but it could. It needs to go on the list. In the other case, the market could go crazy and the house could go up in value. Now, maybe not likely to happen in the next few weeks or something like that, but it could. Put it down on the list. We're thinking broadly. If you're the buyer, if you don't buy that house, you'll buy another house. That's an alternative. You may decide not to buy a house. That's another alternative. You see where I'm going here in terms of looking at all of the alternatives. And then from there, we're going to begin thinking about, okay, what are the alternatives that are most likely to occur? That's the next question. But before I get there, I want to spend some more time here. So as we evaluate these alternatives, if these alternatives are not very good for us, then before we start the negotiation, we've got to think about how we improve the alternatives. How do we get better alternatives available to us? How is it that we make those alternatives likely to occur? What alternatives do we need to pursue to give ourselves more leverage at the table? And so this is an important part of the preparation process. This is really the preparation on substance. We've been talking a lot about process, but here's the one moment where I want to invite you to think about the substance and how to improve the substance of the negotiation. And the way that you can do that will give you more power at the table, will help you be more ambitious in your opening offer, and then also will lower your risk, is to go ahead and to build better alternatives. And that may mean you need to postpone the negotiation 60, 90 days. That's fine. Do it if you can, because improving those alternatives, those are going to put you in a much better place and give you a much better chance of getting a great deal. Okay, so those are alternatives broadly. Now, the next question is, what are the most realistic and likely alternatives, not only for you, but for the other side as well? And so here, I want to ask you to be real, to think about what is the alternative that is most likely going to happen. This is where we're going to start the filtering process. And then as we get to that moment to where we're thinking about that alternative, this is the moment where we can filter out the rest and really start to focus on what is our best alternative. Now, we want to do it for the other side as well, because if we find ourselves to where we have a really good alternative and they do not, well, we can be a little bit more competitive, a little more ambitious in that negotiation. If it's the flip side, we may have to think about a more cooperative approach, because we're probably not going to have the leverage to just use a competitive process to generate a great deal. And so, thinking about the most likely alternative, this is the foundation. This is the key to establishing your bottom line. Now, your bottom line is that place you will only go if it means you get a deal. It is the worst day. And if you can't deliver that day, then you might as well move on to the alternative. The bottom line is not your target. It's not your ideal outcome, but it's the deal you're willing to do to avoid the alternative. And so as we think about the substance of the bottom line, notice with me that it needs to be better than the alternative. Otherwise, you should just pursue the alternative. And so as we're thinking about our bottom line, and here's the moment where we want to define that. And do we want to define it in a way that we are committed to it? One of the most popular questions I get asked is this whole notion about the bottom line, and how do I create a bottom line that I will stick to and will guide me in the negotiation? Because for people that are not as sharp negotiating, when they get to the end and they get pushed, if they're not committed to their bottom line, they will break and they will make a move beyond their bottom line to get the deal. And as a result, they'll lose. And so right here, right now is where we make our commitment. Now, do things happen? Absolutely. Do we learn more information in the deal that may cause us to make a different decision about our bottom line down the road? Absolutely. All of that's okay. That's part of being dynamic in the process. But what's not okay is to say this is going to be the bottom line, but to write it in pencil and have that bottom line be easy to erase and replace as you get into this process. Because if that's your strategy, well, that strategy is going to lead you to losing money or giving value away. Instead, if we develop a bottom line that we're committed to, if we write it down, it's more likely that we are going to drive the process to deliver a deal, hopefully at a place better than that bottom line. But again, on the worst day, at that bottom line. So that's the whole idea of this process is we want to be able to think through it, make the right assumptions, exercise the leverage that we have, and then establish a bottom line that we can actually stick to and will drive our process throughout the entire negotiation. Okay, once we have the bottom line established, now we can start thinking about the ideal outcome. This is where we want to end. This is where we want to deliver the deal. This is the deal that's going to get us the big bonus. This is the deal that's going to land us the big contract. This is the deal that's going to get us a great deal on that house or whatever it is that you're looking to purchase. The ideal outcome is what this is all about. And so once we establish that bottom line, now thinking about the alternatives and the leverage that we have based upon alternatives, here's the moment where we have to get ambitious. We've got to think about what is realistic, what's actually possible. But at the same time, we want to be ambitious. We want to reach for the stars here to say what would be an ideal place for us to end. And so that becomes the whole target. And we set up the whole process to deliver that deal. Now, if it doesn't happen, that's why we have the bottom line. There will be a gap there, and hopefully we can land in that gap someplace. But coming out of the gate, we want to aspire to our ideal outcome. And every move, everything we say, all the signals that we send, all of that needs to point towards the ideal outcome. Now, we can't communicate that to the other side in terms of the ideal nature of it, because the other side, they won't have satisfaction until we know that we're disappointed, until they know that we've given all that we can give, until they know that there is some sense of loss for us so that they can experience a win. And so it's really important that we don't talk about this in the form of an ideal outcome or what we're wanting or things like that. We got to keep all that to ourselves. But as we think about engineering this process, this is the place we're engineering it to. This is the final destination where we want to arrive. And so building this, it goes back into the substance, it goes back into the alternatives, it goes back into all of that preparation work that we've already done. It's building on each other to this moment to where we can identify that place that would be ideal, that place that would be a huge win for us. Now, are we always going to deliver this? No, we won't always deliver it. But if we don't engineer the process to get there, we will never get there. And so this is all about giving us a chance, to giving us our best hope of being able to deliver this deal. And don't be disappointed when it doesn't happen, because many times it won't. Be ready to celebrate when it does, because those days are awesome. But I also want you to give yourself the freedom to know that you're not a failure just because you don't deliver the ideal outcome. This is kind of like this moment where you're reaching for the moon. You don't quite get to the moon, but at the end of the day, you find yourself at a place to where you are among the stars and you are in a really, really good place. So the ideal outcome, that's what we're striving for, and it's possible, but only if you set up the process to go there. So we'll pause right there. We've got another 7 or 8 questions that we'll tackle in the next episode. But what I want you to think about here is this is the moment right before the negotiation where we're setting the process up for success. And we're making sure before we go into the actual process that we are absolutely ready. And so there's some substantive work to do. There's some process work to do. There's some check your assumptions work to do. But this work up front can make you or save you a ton of money if you are disciplined, careful, and thorough in working through these questions and making sure that you are ready to negotiate. All right, it's time for Negotiation Navigator, where we take questions from the listeners. If you want to send us a question, please do so at admin@lowrygroup.net, and we'll try to address it on the air. This next question comes from Catherine, who's a real estate broker, and she asked a really good question about anticipation. And as we think about the preparation process, you'll notice throughout this conversation, I've asked you to not only think about yourself and your alternatives and your bottom line, but I've also asked you to consider all of those things from the perspective of the other side as well. And the reason that we do that is because it's important to get the full picture of how we think the negotiation is going to go. And so Catherine asks a really good question in terms of how to do this. And she writes, I'm a real estate broker. You're asking me to anticipate in negotiations, but how am I supposed to know what the other side is going to do? Well, Catherine, you don't. That is why we're anticipating. We're speculating. And the reality is we won't get it exactly right. The nice thing is this preparation process doesn't depend upon you getting it right. It just depends on you doing that thinking ahead of time and being somewhere in the ballpark. Now, you will know enough about your particular area of negotiation, especially if you do it professionally, that you will be able to get into the ballpark. And even though you don't nail it, there is value in anticipating. And so what happens is really easy. If you anticipate that the other side will demand, let's say, 10% off the price of the house that you're asking. And they come to the table and they make an offer, but it's only 5% off the price. Well, you can then simply adjust your response. Maybe you may give a little more in response to 10% because you're going to try to get that deal done. But in response to 5%, you don't need to give as much in order to get that deal done. Or if you anticipate them asking for 10% off and they ask for 20, well, that's going to impact your decision as well. You may not want to give as much in your next move. You may have to hold back a little bit because they're going to have to come up substantially if there's ever going to be a deal. And so notice, it is not about you nailing it perfectly, but by anticipating that number, it is easier to make your next move in a way that helps you deliver the deal. The other thing I find so often in terms of anticipating is it gives people a sense of confidence to where many times they'll get it pretty close. And so they don't get rattled when the other side does something. They're anticipating, they're ready for it. This is true in many competitive negotiations. In the world that I negotiate in, many times the process starts with really extreme offers on both sides. And so when the other side makes an extreme offer, it's not a big deal. We're ready for it. We know it's coming. It doesn't rattle us. It doesn't throw us off in any way because we've already anticipated it. And so we don't know exactly what it's going to be. We don't know exactly what the number is. We just know it's going to be outrageous. And so as a result of being there and being ready for that, we know how to respond, and it doesn't throw us off our game at all. And so you're right. You won't know exactly what the other side's going to do. That's why we have this process that gets used every day to do business across the world. But if we anticipate, if we're thinking ahead, if we're developing strategy for the different things that could happen, we will be more prepared when they do. And by being prepared, we will be able to stay ahead of the game and to drive a better outcome. Great question, Catherine. Thank you so much. Again, if you've got a question, send it to admin@lowrygroup.net. Thank you again for joining us on this episode, and I hope you'll join us as we wrap up this conversation on preparation. Now, the next 7 or 8 questions that we'll tackle in the next episode, they're all about how we get started and how we launch the process. And so we'll think about opening offers. We'll think about our concession strategy. We'll think about what are the interests of the other side and how do we creatively respond to those interests. That's what's coming next in our next episode of Negotiation Made Simple.